So I am delighted to be speaking with Sarah Howe, a Hong Kong-born British poet and lecturer at King's College London. Her first poetry collection, Loop of Jade, won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2015. And Sarah was Tide's visiting writer in 2017 to 2018 and has continued to work with our project on an ongoing collaboration with the World Museum in Liverpool, which we'll be discussing later in this conversation. So Sarah, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Oh, it's great to be talking to you today, Lorraine.
I just wondered if we could start with the idea of migration and transculturality in your own work. In your poetry collection, Loop of Jade, words take on the qualities of objects. They're full of texture and color. So I think of lines like strangely branching pagan script, the fletched fur of tree, the strung crescent of moon, or fusty sugar paper. And I'm reminded of John Ashbery's line that the words become palpable like a fruit. And at the same time, these words kind of take us somewhere else to other meanings. And so I kind of wondered if you could just say something about the place of this idea of journeying, of moving from one place to another, whether that's traveling to China or moving through language, and how that fits into your writing.
Gosh, what a rich question, Lorraine. And I don't think I recognise that line of Ashbery's. I'll have to go look that up again. That concatenation of thoughts there makes me think of when I was 7 years old and my little brother was 5, and we were prepared for the idea that we were about to move, and I'm doing air quotes here, back home to England, even though it was a country that neither of us had ever lived in, and that my mother had barely visited as a tourist. But even she would talk about coming back home. This is in the context of us living in Hong Kong, which was then, though I didn't realise it, a sort of dying outpost of the British Empire. And my little brother was crying because he thought that moving house and moving country meant that he wouldn't be allowed to bring his toys. And so this sort of scenario of coming to a new place and beginning again was an exciting one, but also a bittersweet one. And looking back on that time as well, I think that my mother had a touch of this, what can we bring with us, immigrant anxiety. My mother's a hoarder. Among the many beautiful things that she hoards and less beautiful things are actually a lot of ornaments and knickknacks and porcelains, a large collection, some of which I think must be valuable and some of which must be charity shop level, came with us from Hong Kong to England.
I wanted to ask about your interest in early modern literature and history as well. I mean, some of the poems in Loop of Jade, such as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, or those poems about Jesuits responding to life in China. I wonder kind of the sources that you drew on for those poems, or where you kind of first came into studying 16th and 17th century history.
So I have a background in Renaissance English literature. I was particularly interested in Sydney, actually, and in the crossover between literature and visual art. That was my PhD topic. Well, I suppose in particular, not just the visual or material art objects, but also the sort of psychology of visual imagination, which I guess goes back to the part of your last question about how can one evoke this quality in poems, in writing, of making the material and visual and sensory world feel like it's present just in these black and white markings written down on a page. And that is something that has fascinated me, sort of both in my own work as a writer, but also in the poetry of the late 16th century, early 17th century in England, where you feel this quality and abundance. I think of texts like Sidney's Arcadia, Spenser's Fairy Queen, which have been with me ever since my undergraduate days, when they first captured my imagination and heart, where you as the reader sort of end up walking through this fantastic gallery of pictures, quite literally, at some points in those poems. And so this is a yeah, this is a fascination that carried me through many years of my early adult life. I suppose it happens that my allegiances have now generally switched over to more contemporary poems, but I feel like that long historical view is something that's still important to my writing. It makes me feel like I'm not able to write often without delving back into the history of words. So etymologies have, in one way or another, often been in the background of my poems, sometimes explicitly traced, and sometimes just there as these echoes which direct my thoughts silently on the page.
Well, that brings us nicely maybe into the question of the tied keywords, which I know you kind of had a look at when you were working on our on this collaboration with us. I mean, did you find it useful to kind of dig into the etymologies of words like traveler and native and denizen, which do kind of appear in your object poems that you wrote for us?
Oh, tremendously so. And I mean, those words I very deliberately placed at these strong nodes in those poems where I knew they would resonate beyond sort of the awareness of the object speaking them, if you see what I mean. I wanted them to have this comet's tail of association behind them that would be even richer for readers coming to the poems who'd been through the amazing resource, which is the Tide Keywords database. The articles on each of those terms was like a chocolate box of treats for my poet's imagination, thinking about these concepts, and also discovering that they have sort of alien resonances that I mean, denizen is an example of a word that is not at the forefront of our minds anymore, but others like home or traveller are so utterly familiar as to maybe need a bit of alienation and defamiliarizing to really open up their treasures. I urge any listeners to look up, say, the entry for traveller in the Tide Keywords database and see what a journey that word itself will take you on. That it might have meant some similar things to the ear of a 16th century British reader, but it might have meant many other things as well. You worked on that database, Loren. Do you want to say something about the experience of doing that and delving into those words?
Well, it was very very much kind of a transformative process, I think, in my own work. You go into it thinking you're familiar with the word and how you're going to encounter it in the archive, and you soon realize that there are so many kinds of resonances within them that were just unfamiliar to me before, and it does open new ways of thinking about the past, but also does really make you think about how these words have changed or evolved over time and the very specific ways in which they're still being used in contemporary discourse to very striking effect. And I think that the clusters of words as well, the kind of combinations of these different words and how they're used and how much their meanings can change just in the kind of context in which they appear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I mean, words that have changed in meaning, but also words that we now use to describe and denote concepts that weren't used back then. Like, I guess I think of race, which is a really interesting one, and the way that you can sort of use the absence of that word in the same sense that we might expect with modern eyes to very immediately show us that concept was sort of very much in formation, and we can't assume anything about how people negotiated or thought it, and it needs really careful scrutiny of sources to unpick those subtleties. These are the sorts of things that I was clued into by my fly on the wall time with you researchers in the Tide project, which was absolutely fascinating, listening into your seminars, listening into your conferences, and your weekly meetings. These sorts of conversations were really, really interesting to me as a writer.
Well, I don't think our keywords have ever been called a chocolate box of treats. So thank you. That's going on our endorsement somewhere. I also I love the use of the keywords in the poem. So I don't think the word, we expected when we had our conversations with you that the word denizen would end up in a poem voiced by a pair of same-sex dog-shaped incense burners, for example. Um, but on that note, and maybe moving a little more towards these object poems, so we've been collaborating with the World Museum in Liverpool on the permanent redisplay of their pre-modern Chinese ceramics, and the 6 object poems that you wrote for Tide are told from the perspective of 6 museum objects. So there's those dog-shaped incense burners. There's the rice wine bowl that's repurposed in Restoration Europe into a sugar bowl and kind of recast with silver handles and things like that. And your object poems kind of resonated with the it narrative or the object narrative. These stories that are told through the points of view of objects, which I think actually first become a fashionable genre in the 18th century. So it seemed quite fitting as well, given the provenance of some of these ceramics and their kind of relationship to this developing world of collecting and consumption. I wonder if you could kind of, speak to the kind of thingness of the objects, or how you found the practical experience of working with the World Museum's Chinese ceramics and that kind of material archive.
Um, Well, the material experience didn't begin in earnest, I suppose, until I'd already selected the 6 objects. Until that point, it was a matter of scouring the catalogue information and with your help, Loren, photographing the potential candidates in the store. There were sort of several removes of mediation involved in the process of narrowing down to the 6, which made it even more special, I suppose, when I was finally able to come to the museum behind the scenes in person and get up close to these things and even handle them. And that meant that I feel like I had an evolving relationship with these things, which I first saw in the middle of a shelf tucked behind lots of other knickknacks, where I'm thinking of the dog incense burners, actually, where they were just peeping through in the background of an image, and I hadn't really noticed them in the dry catalogue spreadsheet. But seeing them peeping through in the photograph, I thought, these are characters speaking to me. So yeah, on the one hand, there was the material objects themselves, obviously, but also there were some other currents feeding into the poems, I suppose. And one of them, as you say, was the sort of 18th century genre of the little life, which seemed, peculiarly apt as a way of thinking about how to write about these objects, because it was coming into its ascendancy just as the craze of porcelain fever was having its ascendancy in England and Europe. It is an enduringly popular genre amongst contemporary poets as well. So a much more up-to-date text that was also in the back of my mind as I was approaching this project was a poem by a contemporary of mine, Francis Leviston, who wrote a poem called A Shrunken Head, about the shrunken heads in the pit rivers. And we just had the announcement on the Today programme this week that the human remains in the pit rivers in Oxford will finally be taken off display. And so I guess what excited me about that poem of hers was the way that it speaks in the voice of this shrunken head, talking about its journey to the museum, and it sort of makes these little swipes and gestures towards the political controversy it's been causing for its curators, and so it's a sort of quite self-aware object. And so I wanted to think about how my chosen 6 ceramic objects would display a similar awareness or lack of awareness, but somehow gesture towards bigger cultural currents that they might not be able to see head on from their position on the mantelpiece, but that they might be able to point us as readers towards. I'd been wanting to write about Chinese export ceramics for years. Ever since in 2012, I went to Jingdezhen in China, in the east of China, which is the center of Chinese porcelain production and has been for centuries. And I'd read the Jesuit accounts by priests like Père d'Entrecol, which very much are in the background of the poems, describing the fires of the kiln and the smoke hanging over the hills on the horizon endlessly of this town. But I also, with my husband, when we went in 2012, you wander around the streets, actually more like dirt tracks in many cases, of that place in China, and it feels like you're being transported back through the centuries, because many of the processes are still very much hand-making pots and bowls and objects on wheels, hand painting and decorating them, but also just the fascination of that material process made me want to write about them. And also, looking back over the photographs that I took of that trip, I noticed that in many of the workshops were little girls of about the age of the Birkenhead schoolgirls who worked on the project in its later stages with us, who were already spending their days being tutored by their parents in how to paint these lustrous, intricate vases. And so that made me think about the life of, your 12, 13-year-old girl in China, in Jingdezhen, being trained in creating these objects.
Because I think that's what we've really tried to do with this collaboration, between Tide and yourself, and also Emma Martin at the World Museum, the other curators and staff, is how do we contextualize these objects in a productive way? How do we raise attention to kind of global commodity chains, which, as you alluded to with the pottery production, can involve a lot of skill and pride and expertise, as well as exploitation or difficult work as well, and how we wrap up all that with the beauty and lustrousness of these objects, the stories these objects tell about traveling, and also how we might bring in some of our own contemporary concerns into all of this mix as well. One of the questions that the exhibition will want to use as a prompt is, do objects dream?
I think the fact that Emma Martin and the rest of the team at the museum have hearkened upon that as one of the key questions of their new exhibition shows quite how amazingly forward-thinking and visionary they are, actually, in the way that they've approached the redesign of the case. I guess there are so many different strands of this project, aren't there? And that is one that you and I, Lorraine, have sort of maybe chipped into a little bit, but have also watched take off in recent times. And I mean, it's exciting that this work will have a permanent legacy, I suppose, in the form of that exhibit. And the idea that these quite complex chains of historical research and thinking about concepts and movement of things and peoples and commodity chains, as you say, that it is interesting, I think, to your visitor wandering through the World Museum on their lunch break. It is interesting because a city like Liverpool is a node on a global network and has been for centuries. And the fact that Liverpool's Chinatown is just down the road from the World Museum is something that was in my mind as well when I was writing these poems. The fact that it is this city where shipping has come through, bringing people, bringing objects from China, from all over the world for such a long time, and that history is alive still in the population of Liverpool, in the form of some more recent immigrants, but also long established communities from other places. And so it felt kind of moving to me to use these objects as a way of talking not just about the distant places that they originated from, but also of the place that they're rooted in now, the Liverpool today, that they speak to. I mean, these questions of how people come and join a society from other places is naturally one of the most hot and contested political issues of our age. Migration has never been more at the top of one's consciousness, and the sort of fieriness of debate around that topic, I'm conscious of, and also think that in writing about objects, that at one remove, it's a way of stepping back maybe from some of the well-run, well-travelled paths of thought around this, to get a little bit more clarity maybe. I certainly felt that somehow in writing about these objects, that was much easier for me than if I'd tasked myself with writing about, say, a Chinese sailor who'd come to Liverpool in centuries past. That would feel like more of an imposition of speculation in a strange way. And so that distancing helped me as a writer with kind of the ethics of, and the appropriate, the questions of appropriation that something like this might raise.
Yeah, I just thought that doing that through objects was really brilliant, and it didn't in any way, even though you were kind of working from a bit of a remove, maybe it didn't feel that way when you read the poems. You have these very moving reflections in them about displacement and about endurance and survival. These objects make it through shipwrecks, and they survive these bombings, in the Blitz bombings that actually destroyed a lot of the museum collections in 1941. And you have lines such as, "I too am a survivor," or "a creature of two worlds, but belonging to none." I mean, these beginnings and these ends of the poems that kind of knit them all together, I found very moving.
The 6 poems all have very different shapes, which for me were kind of mimicking, on some level, the shape and form of the objects, even if not sort of literally or pictorially. But each of them has this sort of corona, almost like a crown of sonnets structure, where the last line of the preceding poem becomes the first line of the next. So there's this sort of baton chain, handing on from one to the next. I guess, yeah, the line that some of the lines that you've just spoken, like the object which was the the rice wine alcohol cup, in its life in China, but became a sugar bowl in its new reincarnation in its life in England, where it was where it had the sort of metal gilding added to it to complete its transformation into its new function and form. This hybrid object, this little cup, the Dehoir ware, it really spoke to me. I think that was the first one that leapt out at me. It was actually in the original World Museum display, and so it was already on exhibit in the museum, and so I saw it on my first trip to the gallery. It spoke to me because it's a hybrid like me. I'm also half English, half white, half Chinese. And so I think this again speaks to this question of how objects might help us get at issues, at questions at a remove, but also maybe more powerfully for that, because it becomes a metaphor. So that object being repurposed, maybe misunderstood even, but also remade, so that it's a creature of two worlds but belonging to none, I think was a new way for me of approaching this question of how one, as a mixed race, as a person of mixed cultural origins, moves through the world, from one country to another, from one culture to another. And so, yeah, I think metaphor is key to this. I also very much wanted there not just to be poignancy, but also humour in that particular poem. So I imagined this bowl being rather self-important, and sort of cursing the clod of a smith who insisted on gilding the lily. So this idiot silversmith, goldsmith, in 17th century London, who didn't understand its sort of integrated, complete beauty that it already had, and clamped this unnecessary metal foot to it.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the humor, because I think the poems do, as you said, through the poignancy of them, also contain quite a surprising playfulness in some places. And that playfulness is going to also shape the way that these objects will be displayed in that permanent redisplay. And I think humor is sometimes something that we scholars don't always look for in the archive. So I really loved finding them in your poems.
I guess the most comic, the most humorous of the poems must be the pair of incense burners, the dogs of Faux. And I felt like there was something about them that definitely called out for a humorous treatment. I mean, they're almost like a little comedy double act, by their very nature, but also the fact that the smoke, one of the apertures for it to be released is from near their bottoms, so they would be sort of farting smoke, which seems to sit oddly with the hallowed, sacred context of their original function, potentially in a shrine. And there's a line in that poem about bubble wrap. I think they still shiver at the sight of bubble wrap, which I thought it was I thought it was very sweet that the curator at the World Galleries, Emma Martin, sort of perked up at that line, because when we first met those incense burners, they were wrapped up very safely in a plastic crate, in bubble wrap, which I think she sort of said maybe they weren't supposed to be in bubble wrap.
Yeah, I think you've made a whole legion of curators at the World Museum feel quite guilty now when they're wrapping their personified objects into boxes and bubble wrap.
Some of these objects were already in the galleries, being seen by visitors, and others were sort of languishing behind in the stores. And I thought that maybe they were sort of conscious of their unchosenness, and their loneliness, that they hadn't been deemed good enough to make the cut. They're not rare, these objects. There are so many of these twin incense burners, I suspect, even in England, they were completely commonplace. And I think that we need to remember that they were mass manufactured, many of these objects, in China for a hungry market. So they're not particularly precious, if you see what I mean, but they have an interest beyond their rarity or preciousness value.
I would love for you to read one of the poems to give us a taste of them now that we've been discussing them, and which will feature in the World Museum display as well.
I thought I would read the sort of the fourth poem in the sequence of six, so not quite the middle of the sequence, but almost the middle of the sequence, which is about. The title is Thinly Potted Porcelain Crock Dish Painted in Underglaze Blue, which is the title of the object was given in the existing museum catalogue and in its label in the former displays case. That's the title that all six of the poems, that's where they get their titles from. This one I thought would be good to read because it sort of, it is, as you say, as you were saying earlier, a story of survival, of kind of awe that these objects, which are so fragile, in many ways, exist at all anymore. Over the years, I've been to many museum displays of Chinese porcelain, Chinese export porcelain, and one thing that had always caught my eye was shipwreck porcelain, where you have these, in some cases, fragments, in some cases, whole objects that have been dredged up from the seabed, oftentimes encrusted with barnacles and little sea creatures. So you have sort of a delicate blue floral motif peeping out from under a salty crust of little barnacle volcanoes. And these things had caught my eye, and I thought, goodness, I must find a way to write about these one day. That these objects had been stowed into the holds of ships, which had then been waylaid on their journeys, sometimes by pirates, sometimes by storms, and sunk. And so these shipwrecks give us a picture of how commodities were moving around the globe at the time when they went underwater. So they're like these little time capsules that archaeologists and historians can use to say, aha, these objects were going in this direction at that time. But I also wanted to think about what it would be like for one of these objects to spend a few centuries at the bottom of the sea, what that would feel like, that sort of state of calm contemplation, not knowing that there would be this end point of being dredged back to the light, but thinking that you could forever be in this sort of twilight world of underwater weeds, until one day an archaeologist comes and scoops you up and brings you back to a museum. I mean, by the way, I have no idea whether the crock dish in the World Museum had this fate, but the connection in my imagination was the fact that crock, the name given to this type of porcelain, comes from Karak. This is actually the first part of the poem, the class of ships that was commonly used to transport this sort of porcelain. It brought back into my mind this pun that was there from the very start of the project for me between these porcelain vessels and the ships, the sea faring vessels that transported them. And so I brought that history into collision with the sort of fragility of the third vessel in this picture, which is the museum, the World Museum, which was so devastatingly burned in the Blitz. We forget, I think, too often that the Blitz wasn't just confined to London, that Liverpool and elsewhere suffered a lot at that time too, and the sort of material form of the contemporary World Museum continues to show those scars. The fact that you have the meeting of the old facade with the more modern supporting structures that hold up a building that was effectively gutted and whose collections were decimated by those flames. But that also creates this sort of imaginative possibility for this kind of creative interaction with those collections, because the provenance information that would often be there just went up in smoke. So I think that's probably all the information that a reader would need to be able to make sense of this poem. Thinly potted porcelain crack dish painted in underglazed blue. Is there a word for it in this new tongue? The class of ships the Portuguese named Caravella and the French Carac. Swift 3 or 4 masters, they were crack to the Dutch, whose guttural pitch I first heard from the sailors who loaded us up in our straw-stuffed crates. Porcelain vessels of diverse sorts, the manifest called us, stowed by the hundreds of thousands. Wares named for those stately ocean-going craft, sailing homeward from the mythic east, freighted with silk and damask, barrels of oakum, quicksilver, cinnabar, camphor, till disaster struck, wrecked off Goa's golden coast. As the cold current of decades flowed past us, my stacked brethren, crusted with barnacles and powdery salt, mouths filling up with silt. Still, some of us continued to gleam like the shells that yawned in those depths. Dredged up from the dark, they pieced my fragments back to wholeness, masked each crack with filler and skill. At last I came to rest in this museum, a heavy Victorian vitrine whose subtly distorting glass recalled for me light filtering through underwater weeds. That night in the Blitz was my last near escape. Nothing like the kiln's clarifying flames. That fire was something else. Ranks of precious artifacts blasted into tinder, their cases smashed, rare specimens reduced to scattered feathers, shards of wired bone. In the aquarium, fish boiled in their tanks or swilled down drains. The model fishing boats went up in smoke. I've seen what it takes to cradle a wreck back to the light. Leaving the fractures for all to see, they rebuilt this place. From the other side of ruin, we found safe passage.
I love that poem. I think that the historian in me really likes the way that these objects become actors in the story of kind of Elizabethan privateering, and you have that reference, the porcelain vessels of diverse sorts, which is I think taken from Richard Hackett's travel book, that phrase.
All the sort of list of things in the manifest.
The object lists, exactly. Like it just feels like it could have been plucked out of a kind of Elizabethan travel tale, with the kind of the silk and the cinnabar and just how evocative even just listing those objects are. But then also just very harrowing, the kind of bombing description and the kind of violence of it, the scattered feathers and the shards of bone and things like that. And I think that ending as well, I've seen what it takes to cradle a wreck back to the light, leaving the fractures for all to see. This idea of rebuilding something or of salvaging a sense of self or optimism from the wreckage just seems particularly resonant in the world that we find ourselves in.
Yes, and a world where we're wondering about what should and shouldn't remain on display, on view for present and future generations, and the picture of the past that we give in that way.
Absolutely. And the kind of stories that we're willing to tell about them, about the objects, I think is something that museums and a lot of researchers are really coming to terms with at the moment. Sarah, thank you so much for chatting with me today. And
And
I
thank
mean,
you.
really, several years now of quite stimulating conversation about research
It's true. It's had a
poetry.
long gestation, this project.
It has, yeah, and I think, as a historian on the project, working with poets and thinking about creative responses to material has really shown me the value or even necessity, I suppose, of kind of leaning into the imagination sometimes and of finding those things that get us, as you say in your poem, to the other side of ruin.
Mm.
So thank you. Our collaboration with the World Museum, which is currently called From Silk Roads to Tudor Ships, Poetry and Porcelain Dream Worlds, can be followed on the Tide and World Museum social media and websites. And thanks again, Sarah.
Thank you.